After we met again, the Mafia boss asked me to marry him. They say time heals all wounds. But some wounds don't heal. They fester. They become a part of you. For 10 years, Elisa Romano has carried such a wound. A phantom limb where a great love used to be. She is an art restorer. A woman whose entire life is dedicated to mending the past. With meticulous care, she pieces together fractured canvases, making broken things whole again. It's a quiet, controlled world she's built for herself, a sanctuary of silence and precision. But the one thing she could never mend was her own shattered heart. Tonight, her sanctuary becomes a tomb. The ghost she spent a decade trying to bury has just walked through her door, and he's not the boy she remembers. He is Enzo Costello, the city's most feared name, a whisper in the shadows who has become a king. The boy who promised her forever has returned as a man who deals in finality. He doesn't come with apologies. He comes with an ultimatum, an offer wrapped in a threat, a proposal that is, in fact, a cage. He demands her hand in marriage, not out of love, but as a contract, a way to claim her, to own her, to protect her from a war she didn't know she was a part of. This is the story of a second chance cloaked in shadows, a tale of a woman forced to bind her future to the man who single-handedly destroyed her past. It is a story of how the deepest love can curdle into the most profound fear, and how the monster you see before you might just be a boy, screaming from behind a mask. So take a deep breath, and let's begin our story. Comment with a crown emoji if you believe a true queen can tame a king of shadows, and subscribe for more tales of forbidden love and impossible devotion. Get ready for a story that will make you question everything you know about love and sacrifice. It's a story of a contract written in ink and sealed in blood. This story is a work of fiction, a romantic tale born from imagination, like a novel made to stir, inspired by the passion of a good book. The scent of linseed oil and plaster dust was Elisa Romano's only company that night. It was a scent that comforted her, the fragrance of history, of captured time. The faint light from her work lamp spilled over an 18th century canvas, revealing a web of minuscule cracks that she was patiently filling. Here, in her small studio at the back of a modest gallery, the outside world with its noise and its hurry ceased to exist. It was just her, the silence and the art. Her world was controlled, meticulous. Each brushstroke was an act of devotion. It was a life she had built to protect herself, a fortress made of routine and solitude. A solitude that was only ever broken by the ghost of a boy with stormy eyes, a 10-year-old memory that still had the power to make her heart stumble. The bell on the gallery's front door chimed, a sharp, wrong sound for this time of night. The fine-tipped brush froze inches from the canvas. Elisa held her breath, her heart giving a painful leap against her ribs. Mr. Gable, the gallery owner, had gone home hours ago. No one should be here. She heard the metallic click of the lock on her studio door being forced. The dry sound echoed in the silence like a bone snapping. The air seemed to solidify in her lungs. Slowly, she stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped a heavy utility knife from her desk. It wasn't a weapon, but it was solid. It was real. The door swung open. 3 men entered. They were dark silhouettes against the dim light of the hallway, all in expensive suits that seemed tailored for bodies accustomed to violence. Their scent invaded Elisa's sanctuary, a mix of expensive cologne, wool damp from the rain outside, and something else, something cold and metallic. 2 of them remained by the door, mountains of muscle and silence. The third advanced. He moved with a lethal grace, a fluidity that contradicted his size. Each step was deliberate, silent. He stopped on the other side of the workbench, the light spilling upwards, carving his face into hard angles and shadows. And Elisa's world shattered. The suit was impeccable, the watch on his wrist worth more than the entire contents of the gallery. But the face, that face was a map of her deepest pain. It was him, and it wasn't him. The features were the same, the strong jaw, the lips that had once been soft and were now a thin, hard line, the thick, dark hair. but the face was a war-torn landscape. There was a small scar near his eyebrow that hadn't been there before. And the eyes. The eyes. They were once the sky before a storm, full of the promise of electricity and passion. Now, they were the frozen silence after it. Empty. Impenetrable. Enzo. The name was a silent scream in her mind. The utility knife slipped from her sweaty fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. He didn't seem to recognize her. His eyes swept the studio with calculated indifference, landing on the painting on the easel. A beautiful piece. His voice was deeper than she remembered. A low, controlled growl. A shame Mr. Gable doesn't value his possessions as much as we value our agreements. So that was it. Debt collectors. Mr. Gable had mentioned problems, but Elisa never imagined this. She found her voice, a fragile whisper. What do you want? Only then did his eyes land on her. Truly. And for a fraction of a second, the mask of ice cracked. A spark of something shock, recognition, pain flashed in the dark depths before it was extinguished. The indifference returned, but now it was forced. It was a wall, hastily erected. He didn't say her name. The omission was crueler than any insult. Our business is not with you, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He turned to the painting. Take it. Elisa's world spun. That painting was her life's work, a 6-month restoration. It was delicate, fragile. His men moved to grab it. No! The cry tore out of her, stronger than she expected. You can't. It will be damaged. It needs specialized handling. Enzo turned to her slowly. A cold smile touched his lips, a gesture that did not reach his eyes. Then perhaps Mr. Gable should have thought of that before he used our money to buy art he couldn't afford. Desperation made her step forward. Please, Enzo, please. His name on her lips. It was the first time she'd spoken it in 10 years. The sound seemed to hit him physically. He stiffened, his jaw tightening so hard a muscle jumped. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an untold story, with a decade of silence and pain. He raised a hand and his men stopped. The ensuing silence was an abyss. Leave it, he commanded, his voice hoarse. And without another glance at her, he turned and walked out. His men followed, leaving Elisa standing, trembling, amidst the lingering scent of his cologne and the threat he left behind. She didn't see him for 3 days. 3 days in which she barely ate or slept, the reunion replaying in her mind like a form of torture. The monster he had become was more frightening than the ghost of the boy she had loved. On the 4th night, he found her as she was leaving the gallery. Rain was falling, a fine, cold drizzle that turned the city lights into melancholic blurs. He simply materialized from the darkness, a specter in a black overcoat. We need to talk, it wasn't a request. He led her into a nearby alley, away from the few pedestrians. The sound of the rain on the rooftops was the only noise. He stood under a small awning, but she remained in the rain, letting the cold water run down her face, mixing with the tears she refused to shed. What do you want from me, Enzo? I have a proposal, he said, ignoring her broken tone. A solution to Mr. Gable's problems, and to yours. She laughed, a joyless sound. I don't have any problems. You were my problem and you disappeared. The truth of those words seemed to land, but his face remained impassive. You're in danger, Elisa. The only danger I see here is you. There's another family, the Falcones. They don't play by the rules. A war is coming. Anyone from my past, anyone who could be seen as a weakness, is a target. Her heart beat faster, this time from real fear. What does that have to do with me? He stepped out from under the awning, into the rain with her. The water plastered his dark hair to his forehead, making his eyes seem even darker. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. You're going to marry me. The words hung in the cold air between them, absurd, insane. Elisa felt the ground disappear from under her feet. You're crazy. It's the only way, he continued, his voice low and urgent, the only emotion he had shown. As my wife, you'll be under my protection, Untouchable. No one will dare come near you. No, never. It's not a request, he said, and the warmth was gone, replaced by ice. He gripped her chin, forcing her to look at him. His touch burned. It's a contract. You marry me, and the gallery's debt is forgiven. You live. You stay safe. You refuse. And I can't guarantee what the Falcones will do when they find out who you were to me. It was a sentence, not a proposal. A cage being locked around her. She looked into the eyes of the man who had once promised her the future and saw only the abyss. The boy she loved was dead. In his place stood a king of shadows, and he was demanding her life as tribute. You've become a monster, she whispered, her voice choked. A flicker of pain crossed his face, so fast she almost thought she imagined it. Yes, he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. And you will be the monster's wife. The Costello estate was not a house. It was a mausoleum of marble and silence. It stood on a hill overlooking the city, a fortress of tinted glass and gray stone that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. For Elisa, it was the setting of an elegant nightmare. There was no ceremony, no white dress, just the signing of a document in the grim office of a blank-faced lawyer and a heavy, cold diamond ring sliding onto her finger. A ring that felt more like a shackle than a promise. Her new home was a labyrinth of long hallways and vast rooms, decorated with an impersonal luxury that screamed wealth but whispered loneliness. Ancient tapestries adorned the walls, classical statues guarded the corners, and the furniture was as expensive as it was uncomfortable. It was a museum, not a home, and she was the newest addition to the collection. The first few days were a disorienting haze. She was treated with a cold deference by the staff of silent employees whose eyes never met hers. She had access to an endless wardrobe, a private chef, any material whim she could imagine. But freedom was an illusion. There was always a guard in a dark suit at a respectful distance, a constant presence that reminded her of her status. A prisoner. Enzo was a ghostly presence. He slept in a separate bedroom at the end of an endless hall. She saw him only at dinner, a silent, tense ordeal in a dining room that could seat 50. They sat at opposite ends of a long mahogany table, the space between them a battlefield of unspoken words. He watched her. She felt the weight of his gaze on her as she tried to force food down her tight throat. It wasn't a look of desire, or even affection. It was the look of a museum guard watching over a priceless, volatile artifact. Assessing. Possessive. She hated him for it. Hated the cold calm with which he had destroyed her life. Hated the man he had become, an empty shell filled with power and darkness. And somewhere deep and terrifying, she hated herself for searching, amidst that ruin, for the wreckage of the boy she had loved. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the suffocating opulence, she discovered a discreet door in a lesser-used wing of the mansion. The scent wafting from within was familiar, a gasp of air for a drowning lung. Linseed oil. Turpentine. She pushed the door open. The room was an art studio. Northern light streamed in through an immense skylight, illuminating empty easels, a pristine workbench stocked with the finest pigments and brushes, and blank canvases of all sizes. It was the studio of her dreams, and it was an even more exquisite cage. "I thought you might like it," Enzo's voice came from the doorway. She spun around, her heart leaping. He was leaning against the doorframe, his suit jacket gone, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to his elbows. For an instant, with the soft light falling on him, he looked younger, less Dawn. "You did this?" she asked, her voice lower than she intended. He shrugged, a contained gesture. "I remember you saying that northern light was the only honest light for a painter." The memory hit her like a punch. A summer afternoon, lying in the grass, she was 18, he was 20. She had talked endlessly about her dreams, about art, about the light. He had listened with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. The memory was so vivid it hurt. "Don't buy me with gifts, Enzo," she said, her voice steadying, hardening. "I'm not one of your trinkets." His mask slid back into place. It's not a gift. It's a tool. Keep yourself busy. It's better for both of us. He was about to leave when she spoke again. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why are you doing this? He paused, his back to her. The silence stretched. I told you, to protect you. No, she insisted, taking a step toward him. 10 years ago. Why did you disappear? Without a word, without a note. You just evaporated. His shoulders tensed. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Her voice broke. I thought you were dead. Then I thought you just never cared. Which was the worst lie, Enzo? He turned slowly. His face was a blank canvas, but his eyes were a contained hurricane. Believe the second one, he said, his voice as sharp as broken glass. It's safer. And he was gone, leaving her alone in the perfect studio, her heart broken all over again in a brand new way. That night, the danger he spoke of became real. She was in her room, trying to read, when the subtle sound of crunching gravel from outside caught her attention. The estate was surrounded by a state-of-the-art security system. No sound should be unexpected. She went to the bulletproof glass window and looked down at the meticulously manicured gardens. Nothing, just the shadows of the trees dancing in the moonlight. She was about to turn away, chiding her own paranoia, when she saw it. A single white rose, left in the center of the stone path. It didn't belong there. The mansion's rose bushes were all red, a grim preference of Enzo's late mother. A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't what it was, but what it meant. Someone had been there. Someone had gotten past all the security. It was a message. I can get to you. Her bedroom door burst open. Enzo strode in, his face pale with fury. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the rose below. Stay away from the window, he snarled. His calm was gone. The calculating Don had vanished, replaced by a cornered predator. He grabbed a phone, his voice low and lethal as he barked orders. Words like perimeter, breach, and find him were spat out with a terrifying urgency. When he hung up, the silence in the room was electric. What was that? Elisa asked, her voice a thread. Falcone, he said, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that humanized him for an instant. Marco Falcone. He likes games, sending messages. And what does the rose mean? Enzo finally looked at her, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes, not for himself, for her. In the old country, he said, his voice grim, a white rose on your doorstep. It was a warning, a kiss of death. The floor seemed to give way. She stumbled back until her legs hit the edge of the bed. The fear was a cold, heavy thing in her stomach. Enzo was right. She was a target. This contract, this golden cage, it was the only thing keeping her alive. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and stood before her. He didn't touch her, but the intensity of his presence was a physical force, pushing the air from her lungs. Do you understand now, Elisa? His voice was almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of thunder. This is the world I live in. There is no escape. For either of us. She looked at his face, at the fury and the fear warring in his eyes, and she understood. The boy she loved wasn't dead. He was buried. Buried under the weight of an empire, a name, a world that forced him to become a monster to survive. And he had pulled her into the grave with him. That night, for the first time, Elisa locked her bedroom door. But she knew, with a terrifying clarity, that the lock wouldn't keep the danger out. The danger was already inside, wearing the face of the only man she had ever loved. The White Rose incident changed everything. Fear, once an abstraction, was now a constant companion, a cold shadow that clung to Elisa even under the glow of crystal chandeliers. The golden cage grew smaller, its invisible walls closing in around her. The presence of the guards became more oppressive, and the mansion's silence, once merely lonely, now felt predatory, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting. But fear was a catalyst. Elisa's passivity, born of shock and grief, began to erode, replaced by a sharp and biting survival instinct. She refused to be a helpless pawn in Enzo's game. If this was his world, she needed to learn the rules. She began to watch. In her studio, she found a kind of focus. Restoring art required patience, an eye for hidden details, the ability to see the layers beneath the surface. She applied the same technique to her new environment. During the tense dinners, she stopped staring at her plate and started studying Enzo. She watched the way his jaw tightened when his second-in-command, a burly man named Rocco, gave him a report. She noticed how his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly when his consigliere, an older, slender man named Luciano, spoke. Luciano was a relic from Enzo's father's regime. He exuded an aura of ancient, almost servile loyalty. But there was something in his gaze, a calculating coldness that didn't match his subservient posture. He treated Elisa with an exaggerated politeness that made her skin crawl. It was the kind of courtesy one extends to an object, not a person. He saw her as a weakness, an unwelcome complication in the Castello Empire. Elisa began to perceive the undercurrents of power. The men loyal to Enzo were younger, more brutal, like Rocco. The old guard, loyal to the memory of Enzo's father, gravitated toward Luciano. And there was a palpable tension between the two factions, a friction that Enzo managed with a chilly authority. One night, unable to sleep, she went down to the library in search of a book. The door was ajar and she heard voices, Enzo's, low and sharp, and Luciano's, smooth and oily. An unnecessary risk, Enzo. The girl attracts attention. Falcone would not have dared such a direct move if not for her, Luciano was saying. She is not up for discussion. Enzo's reply was final, leaving no room for debate. The security breach. I want a name. We are looking into all possibilities, Luciano said. But perhaps the breach is not with our men. Perhaps the information comes from a place you don't expect. She has a past. Friends. Family. Someone could have talked. The silence that followed was heavy. Elisa held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was accusing her, insinuating that she was the leak. Be careful, Luciano. Enzo's voice was a steel thread. You're on thin ice. Elisa shrank back into the shadows of the hallway, her blood running cold. She wasn't just seen as a weakness. She was being painted as a traitor. Luciano was trying to poison Enzo against her. But why? The answer came to her with a sudden, frightening clarity. If Elisa were removed, discredited, exiled, or worse, Enzo's greatest distraction would vanish. He would go back to being the focused, ruthless Don the old guard wanted, his father's heir, not the man haunted by a ghost from his past. She had to prove her worth. She had to show Enzo she was not a porcelain doll to be protected, but a queen to be reckoned with. The opportunity arose in an unexpected form. Enzo was hosting a charity event, a facade for a meeting with the heads of other neutral families to solidify alliances against Falcone. The event would be held at the mansion itself. Elisa, as Mrs. Costello, was expected to play the part of the perfect hostess. She threw herself into the preparations with the same precision she used in her studio. But while she discussed flower arrangements and menus with the planners, her ears were open, her mind recording every detail. On the night of the event, the mansion transformed. The silence was replaced by the murmur of conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. Elisa wore an emerald silk gown, an elegant creation that was both armor and attire. At Enzo's side, she was the picture of grace and composure. She greeted the guests, smiling, her hand resting lightly on Enzo's arm. But her eyes were working. She watched Luciano hovering near one of the family heads, Don Moretti, a man known for his neutrality and his greed. Their conversation was discreet, but Luciano's body language was tense. Later, while circulating, she passed a secluded terrace. The sound of a conversation made her pause. It was two of Falcone's younger thugs, disguised as waiters. They obviously didn't recognize her, seeing only the trophy wife. As the consigliere said, the package will be in place tomorrow at noon, one of them said. The target always goes to the botanical garden on Thursdays. Alone. Elisa's heart stopped. The target. Thursdays. the botanical garden. It was her. It was her one permitted outing from the mansion. A weekly visit she had insisted on keeping, a small remnant of her old life. Only a handful of people in Enzo's inner circle knew that detail. And Luciano was one of them. The consigliere, the package. It was a trap. Luciano was handing her over to Falcone. The blood drained from her face. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her, a cold wave that left her breathless. She could run to Enzo, tell him everything. But it would be her word. The girl who was a risk, against that of his trusted advisor. She needed more. She needed proof. She composed herself, the fear solidifying into a cold resolve. She walked back into the ballroom, the smile still in place. She met Enzo's eyes from across the room. There was a silent question in them, a concern he tried to hide. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod, an attempt to reassure him. Her brain worked feverishly. She needed a way to expose Luciano without putting herself directly in the line of fire. The solution came to her, a risky idea born of desperation and her understanding of this world. Loyalty was bought and sold. Honor was a commodity. She found Rocco, Enzo's right-hand man, near the bar. He was loyal to Enzo, and he viscerally distrusted Luciano. "Rocco," she said, her voice low and calm, "I need a favor," without Enzo knowing. The burly man looked at her in surprise. "Mrs. Costello, I don't—" "Listen carefully," she cut him off, the authority in her voice startling him. "Tomorrow, at noon, at the Botanical Garden. I will be there, but I won't be alone. I want you and your most loyal men in the shadows. Unseen. Just watch. And record everything." Rocco frowned, confusion and suspicion warring on his face. "What's going to happen?" Elisa glanced across the room, where Luciano was now smiling at her. A cold, predatory smile. "I think," she said, her voice as steady as steel, "the rat is finally going to come out of its hole." She was offering herself up as bait. It was a dangerous, perhaps suicidal move, but it was the only move she had. She was no longer the art restorer who hid from the world. She was the Shadow's wife, and it was time she learned how to hunt in the dark. The Botanical Garden was Elisa's sanctuary, an oasis of life and color amidst the city's gray concrete. On that Thursday, however, every petal seemed as sharp as a razor, and every shadow hid a threat. The air, normally fragrant with the smell of damp earth and blossoms, felt heavy, charged with the electricity of a decisive moment. She walked slowly along the main path of the orchid greenhouse, the sound of her shoes on the stone path echoing in the humid silence. Her heart was a steady drum against her ribs, a beat of fear and determination. She wore a simple dress, no jewelry, her hair pinned up casually. She had to look vulnerable, the perfect bait. With every step, she fought the urge to look over her shoulder, to search for Rocco's men in the shadows of the giant ferns. She had to trust. She had to believe that his loyalty to Enzo was stronger than his obedience to Luciano. It was a blind gamble. She sat on a wrought iron bench, facing a cascade of rare orchids, and opened a book. Her hands were shaking so much the words danced on the page. "Breathe, Elisa. Just breathe." She repeated the mantra in her mind, forcing a calm she did not feel. She didn't have to wait long. 2 men appeared at the end of the path. They didn't wear the expensive suits of Enzo's men. Their clothes were cheaper, ill-fitting. Their faces were hard, their eyes empty. They moved with the sloppy arrogance of predators who know their prey is cornered. Elisa's blood ran cold. They were Falcone's men. They approached, flanking the bench. The smell of cheap cigarettes and sweat mingled with the perfume of the flowers. "Elisa Costello?" One of them's voice was rough, like gravel. She looked up from her book, feigning a startled expression. It wasn't difficult. The fear rising in her throat was real, suffocating. "Yes? Can I help you?" The man laughed, an ugly sound that desecrated the tranquility of the greenhouse. "I think you can. The boss wants to have a word with you, a private chat." They grabbed her by the arms. Their grip was brutal, fingers digging into her skin. The book fell to the ground. its pages splayed open like broken wings. Panic exploded in her chest, a blinding white wave. Where is Rocco? Where the hell is he? They began to drag her down the path, towards a service exit at the back of the greenhouse. Elisa's mind raced. The plan was for Rocco to intervene, for him to catch Falcone's men, and the traitor red-handed. But something was wrong. The rescue wasn't coming. She remembered what Enzo had said. Falcone likes games. Maybe Luciano wasn't going to be there to be caught. Maybe his plan was simpler. Just hand her over and let Falcone do the dirty work. And Rocco, not seeing Luciano, wouldn't intervene, afraid of starting an open war. She had been naive, and now she was going to pay the price. No, she would not be a passive victim. Using all her strength, she stomped hard on the foot of the man to her right and dug her nails into the arm of the other. They grunted in surprise, their grip loosening for a split second. It was enough. She tore free and ran. She didn't run back down the main path, but plunged into the dense foliage, pushing her way through wide, damp leaves. Branches scratched at her face and arms, but she didn't feel it. The sound of her pursuers cursing and crashing through the plants behind her was the only fuel she needed. She stumbled out into another part of the garden, the noon sun blinding her for an instant. She saw a small tool shed ahead. It was her only chance. She sprinted inside, the smell of earth and metal filling her nostrils. She hid behind a stack of fertilizer bags, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. She frantically searched for something, anything, she could use as a weapon. Her hand found the cold wooden handle of a small gardening trowel. It was heavy. It would have to do. The shed door was kicked open, flooding the space with light. The silhouettes of the two men appeared in the doorway. "Think you could get away, doll?" one of them said, stepping inside slowly. "We like it when they fight. Makes it more fun." Elisa remained motionless. The trowel gripped tightly in her hand. Her breath caught in her throat. The moment seemed to stretch into infinity. And then all hell broke loose. There was no warning. One of the men in the doorway simply pitched forward, a wet, gurgling sound escaping his throat. Behind him, a figure materialized out of the sunlight. A shadow. Enzo. He wasn't in a suit. He wore black trousers and a dark shirt that molded to a body built for efficient violence. His face was a mask of primal fury, a rage so pure and terrifying it made Falcone's men freeze. His eyes weren't cold. They burned. They were the flames of an avenging demon. The second thug drew a gun, but he never had a chance. Enzo moved with a blurred speed. There was a dry crack of bone, and the man collapsed. Enzo turned to the first man, who was still alive, choking on the floor. He grabbed him by the collar, hauling him into the air as if he weighed nothing. "Who sent you?" Enzo's voice wasn't human. It was a growl from the depths of hell. The man just stared at him, eyes wide with terror. "Who?" Enzo repeated, squeezing. "Told you to touch her?" He didn't wait for an answer. There was another sound, quick and final. And then, silence. A silence broken only by Elisa's ragged breathing and the drip of something dark onto the concrete floor. Enzo stood over the bodies, his chest heaving. Slowly, he turned to her. The fury in his eyes was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Relief. Panic. Pain. He crossed the shed and knelt in front of her. His hands hovered over her arms, as if he were afraid to touch her, to break her. "Are you okay?" His voice was hoarse, fragile. "Did he hurt you? Elisa, talk to me." She just stared at him, at the blood on his hands, at the violence he had unleashed for her. The trowel fell from her fingers with a clatter. Tears she didn't even know she was holding back began to roll down her face. How did you know?" she whispered. "Rocco," he said, finally touching her face, his thumb wiping away a tear. "He called me. He said your plan was insane, that he couldn't risk it. He told me everything." The relief hit her so hard she almost fainted. The plan hadn't failed. It had worked. Enzo pulled her into his arms. His embrace wasn't gentle. It was desperate. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, as if he wanted to absorb her, to merge her with him so they could never be separated again. She could feel the tremor running through his body. The great and feared Don Costello was shaking. "I thought I'd lose you," he whispered against her skin, his voice broken. Again. And that's when the truth hit her, a revelation that changed the landscape of her heart. This violence, this monster, it was armor, and the only thing that could break it was her. He pulled back, just enough to look into her eyes. The fury had dissipated, leaving behind a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "Why didn't you tell me, Elisa? Why risk your life like this?" "Because it was my word against his," she said, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Would you have believed me?" The question hung between them, heavy with the weight of 10 years of distrust and silence. "Let's go home," he said finally, his voice low. "It's time you knew the truth. About everything." He helped her to her feet. As they walked out of the dark shed and into the sunlight, Elisa knew that nothing would ever be the same. The war outside was real, but the more important battle, the one being fought within the walls of that mansion and within their hearts, was about to begin. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a combatant. The ride back to the mansion was conducted in a heavy, dense silence. Enzo drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a force that turned his knuckles white. His eyes were fixed on the road, but Elisa knew he wasn't seeing the asphalt in front of him. He was lost in a much darker place. She, in turn, was wrapped in a blanket he had pulled from the trunk, her body still trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline and fear. The violence she had witnessed in the shed replayed in her mind. But strangely, it wasn't what scared her the most. What terrified her was the raw vulnerability she had seen in his eyes, the abject fear of losing her. It was an emotion far too powerful to belong to a simple contract. When they arrived, the mansion felt different. The guards were on high alert, their postures rigid, their eyes scanning every shadow. Inside, the air was charged. Rocco met them in the entrance hall, his face a mask of concern. "Luciano?" Enzo asked, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was the calm before a hurricane. "In your office, he doesn't know that we know," Rocco replied. "Keep him there, no one in, no one out," Enzo ordered. He turned to Elisa. "Come." He didn't lead her to her room. He guided her down the hall, past his own bedroom, to a door at the end of the wing she had never noticed before. He opened it, revealing not a bedroom, but a private study, smaller and more intimate than the formal office downstairs. The room was the essence of Enzo. One wall was lined with books, not fiction, but history, strategy, and philosophy. There was a faint scent of whiskey and leather. On a dark oak desk, next to a closed laptop, was a single object that didn't belong, a small, worn drawing pad with a charcoal pencil resting on it. Enzo went to a small bar in the corner and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass. He drank it in a single, tense swallow. He didn't offer her any. He turned, leaning back against the desk, the empty glass in his hand. The distance between them in the small room felt like a chasm. "You asked me why I disappeared," he began, his voice low and hoarse. "You deserve to know the truth. Not the half-truth that Luciano and the others know, but the whole truth." Elisa waited, her heart a slow, heavy beat in her chest. "My father," Enzo said, "was not the man the world saw. He was the Don, yes. But he was tired. He wanted out. He was negotiating a peaceful transition to hand over power to another family in exchange for security for ours." He paused, his eyes lost in a painful memory. "I was 20. I was stupid. I was in love. I was thinking about you, about a future far away from all this, a normal life, a life my father wanted for me." He looked at her, and for the first time, the boy she once knew was there, looking out from behind the monster's eyes. "The night I was going to tell you everything, to ask you to run away with me. They killed him. Falcone. Not in a street ambush. In our own home. A betrayal. They executed him in front of my mother." Elisa's breath caught in her throat. The image was so brutal she felt a physical chill. "I found him," Enzo continued, his voice empty. That night, the world as I knew it ended. The peaceful transition was a lie. Falcone wanted everything. He wanted to exterminate us. The only thing that stopped him was that my father's men, the old guard, forced me to take over. They needed a Costello in charge to keep the troops loyal. They put me on my father's throne while his blood was still on the rug. He looked up at her, and the pain in his eyes was an ocean. I had two choices. Let my family be hunted down and killed, or become what they needed me to be. A leader, a killer, a monster. And the first thing a monster does is destroy everything he loves so his enemies can't use it against him. The understanding hit her, a shockwave that left her breathless. He didn't abandon me. He protected me. Disappearing from your life wasn't a choice, Elisa. It was a sacrifice, he said, his voice finally breaking. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every day, for 10 years, I wondered if you were safe, if you were happy. I hired people to watch you from a distance, to make sure no trouble ever came near you. I watched you build your life, your career, and I hated myself for not being able to be a part of it. The contract, she whispered, the pieces falling into place. The marriage. It was the only way to bring you close, inside my walls, where I could truly protect you. Falcone grew stronger. The war my father tried to avoid became inevitable. Bringing you into my life was the most selfish and the most selfless act I've ever committed. I put you in danger, and it was the only way to keep you alive. The silence in the room was profound, filled only by the beating of two broken hearts. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. The abandonment, the cruelty, the monster. It was all a facade, an armor forged in hell to protect the one pure thing left in his world. She crossed the space between them, each step undoing a decade of pain. She stopped in front of him, and hesitantly raised her hand and touched the scar near his eyebrow. How? First week, he said, his voice a murmur, a reminder from Falcone that my father's shoes were too big for me. She traced the line of his jaw, the stubble scratching her fingertips. The boy I loved isn't dead, she said, her voice steady. He was just hiding. Enzo's self-control finally shattered. He pulled her to him, the movement sudden and desperate. One of his hands tangled in her hair, the other wrapped around her waist, pressing her against him. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of surrender. It was a kiss of 10 years of pain, of longing, of unspoken words. It tasted of whiskey, of regret, and of a truth finally set free. It was the confession of a man who had given up his soul to save hers. When they finally broke apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I never stopped loving you, Elisa. Not for 1 second. I know, she whispered. Now I know. In that moment, the contract of shadows dissolved. There was no more Mrs. Costello, the trophy wife, nor the Don, the Mafia boss. There was just Enzo and Elisa, two halves of the same story, finally pieced back together. But the peace was fleeting. The reality of their world knocked on the door, in the form of a discreet rap. Rocco. Enzo pulled away, the mask of the Don slowly sliding back into place. But something had changed. His eyes, when they met hers, were no longer cold. They were possessive, protective, and they held a promise. Wait here, he said. He opened the door. Take her to her room. Double the guard. No one gets near. He ordered one of the guards in the hall. He turned to Rocco. Let's finish this. As she was escorted away, Elisa looked back and saw Enzo and Rocco walking toward the main office. She knew where he was going. He was going to face Luciano. He was going to tear out the betrayal by the root. And she knew, with a certainty that filled her with both dread and pride, that the monster she had so feared was about to be fully unleashed. But this time, he wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for them. Elisa couldn't stay in her room. Passivity was no longer an option. Guided by a visceral need to be near him, she followed the path she had seen Enzo take, stopping in the shadows of the hallway, a safe distance from the massive door of the main office. She couldn't hear the words, The wood was too thick, but she could feel the tension radiating from the room, a low, dangerous pressure, like the air before a lightning strike. Inside the office, the scent of stale cigars and betrayal hung in the air. Luciano was sitting in one of the leather armchairs in front of Enzo's desk, trying to project a calm he did not feel. An untouched glass of brandy sat on a small table beside him. He stood as Enzo entered. "Enzo, finally. Rocco has been acting very strangely, keeping me here," he began, his voice sounding falsely paternal. Enzo didn't answer. He walked slowly to his desk, each step heavy with a promise of violence. Rocco closed the door behind them, the click of the lock sounding like the sealing of a tomb. "You served me well for many years, Luciano," Enzo said, his voice dangerously calm. "You served my father well." Luciano glanced at the tablet. On the screen, a video was looping. It was a grainy but clear recording from the botanical garden. It showed Falcone's 2 men approaching the bench. And then, it showed a third man, in the distant shadows. Watching it all, his face turned to the camera for a fleeting instant. It was Luciano. The color drained from the consigliere's face. The brandy glass trembled in his hand. "Enzo, this is a misunderstanding. I was there to ensure the girl was safe. I suspected a trap and—" "Don't lie to me," Enzo cut him off, his voice dropping to a lethal growl. "Not now, not in my house." He leaned over the desk, power radiating from him in palpable waves. "Did you think I wouldn't see? You, and the other dinosaurs who think this empire still belongs to my father. You see her as a distraction, a weakness. You thought that if you removed her, I would go back to being the puppet you wanted me to be when you placed the crown on my head." The fear in Luciano's eyes was replaced by a bitter resentment. The mask fell. "She is a weakness. Look at you. Chasing ghosts, starting a war we can't win, all for a girl who should have stayed in the past. Your father would never have risked everything for a sentiment." "My father is dead!" Enzo roared, slamming his fist on the desk with a force that made the tablet jump. "He's dead because he trusted men like you. Men who talk of honor but only know greed. Did Falcone promise you a seat at his table, Luciano? A bigger piece of the pie?" Luciano's silence was his confession. "You didn't betray me, Luciano," Enzo said, his voice now a frozen whisper that was more terrifying than his shouts. "You betrayed the Costello name. You spat on the grave of the man who gave you everything." He straightened up. "Rocco." Rocco stepped forward, his face impassive. "Take him to the cellar," Enzo said, turning his back on the man who was once his mentor. "And send a message to Marco Falcone. Return what belongs to him, piece by piece." Luciano collapsed back into the chair, the sound of a broken man. "Enzo, please, for your father's memory." Enzo paused at the door but didn't turn. "My father's memory is the only reason your death won't be quick." The door closed. From the hallway, Elisa heard a single, muffled sob, and then nothing. She shrank further into the shadows, her heart pounding. She had seen Enzo's fury, but now she understood his justice. It was brutal. It was final. But it was the code of this world. A world she now inhabited. She returned to his private study, the small sanctuary where he had bared his soul. She waited. She didn't know for how long. Time seemed to have lost its meaning. When Enzo finally entered, he looked exhausted. The weight of the decision, of the violence, was etched on his face. He had washed his hands, but she felt he could still smell the stench of betrayal on them. He stopped in front of her, uncertainty in his eyes. The dynamic between them had fundamentally changed. The contract was broken, the truth was out. What were they now? "It's over," he said, his voice tired. "The threat inside the house has been removed." "But the war outside hasn't," she replied, more a statement than a question. "No. Falcone will retaliate. Now, more than ever. He knows he failed." He paused, searching for the words. "Elisa, what I told you, about protecting you, is still true. But the contract, the deal I forced on you, it's not enough anymore. It's not honest anymore." He took a step toward her, closing the small distance between them. He took her hand, turning it palm up. The diamond ring on her other finger felt cold and foreign. That, he said, glancing at the ring, was a symbol of ownership, a brand, a way to chain you to me, to keep you safe. He looked up, meeting her eyes, and the intensity in his gaze left her breathless. I don't want to chain you anymore. I want you to stay. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It wasn't a velvet box. It was a simple, unadorned white gold band. It was my grandmother's, he said, his voice hoarse. She said that love doesn't need diamonds to shine. It just needs truth. He slid the diamond ring from her finger and placed it on the desk. The gesture was final. He took the simple band and held it between them. The contract is over, Elisa, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. Now I'm asking you, not as the Don, not as your protector, but as the man who never stopped loving you, even when I was a world away. He knelt, the powerful, feared Enzo the Shadow Costello, kneeling on the floor of his study. Marry me, he said, his voice cracking. For real. Not to be my prisoner in a golden cage, but to be my partner, my advisor, my queen. Not to hide behind me, but to fight beside me. Marry me, Elisa Romano. Tears streamed down Elisa's face. But this time, they were not of fear or sorrow. They were of relief, of a homecoming that was 10 years in the making. She looked at the man kneeling before her, the monster and the boy, the demon and the savior, all in one, and she saw her future. Yes, she whispered, the word a breath of life. Yes, Enzo, I will marry you. He slid the simple, warm band onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He stood and kissed her, and this time, the kiss was not of surrender, but of a beginning. It was a kiss of promise, of shared power, and of a love that had survived hell and come back, stronger and truer than ever before. The war with Falcone was far from over, but for the first time they weren't alone. They had each other. And that, they knew, was the only weapon they truly needed. Elisa's yes changed the atmosphere of the mansion more profoundly than any gang war ever could. The fear and tension didn't vanish. They hovered at the periphery, a dark promise of the coming storm with Falcone, but the heart of the house now beat with a new energy. The dynamic between Enzo and Elisa, once a game of power and survival, transformed into a partnership forged in fire. The change in Elisa was the most remarkable. The quiet, reserved art restorer didn't disappear. Instead, her innate qualities, patience, keen observation, the ability to see beneath the surface became her greatest weapons. She didn't wield a gun, but her influence began to be felt in every corner of the Costello Empire. She started attending Enzo's meetings. At first, his men, especially the old guard, treated her with a veiled condescension. She was the wife, a beautiful ornament in the chair beside the Don. Elisa didn't take offense. She listened. While they discussed shipments, territories, and retaliations with the brute force of men accustomed to solving problems with fists and bullets, Elisa saw the patterns. She saw the flaws in their logic, the emotional vulnerabilities they mistook for strength. One evening, they were planning a counterattack on one of Falcone's warehouses, a retaliatory operation for the kidnapping attempt. Rocco was outlining a plan of frontal assault, a show of force. "We go in hard," Rocco growled, tapping a finger on a map of the city. "Hit them by surprise. Burn it all down. Show Falcone you don't mess with the boss's bride." "He'll be expecting that." Elisa's calm voice cut through the testosterone-heavy air of the room. All eyes turned to her. Enzo, who sat at the head of the table, simply watched her, a shadow of a smile on his lips. He knew what was coming. "What?" Rocco asked, slightly offended. "Marco Falcone is not a fool," Elisa continued, leaning forward, her eyes fixed on the map. "He knows Enzo is furious. He knows the first reaction of a man like Enzo is direct, violent retaliation. The warehouse will be prepared for an attack. It's bait." A murmur went through the room. "So what do you suggest, madam?" one of the older capos asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. We send flowers? No, Elisa said, her cool gaze meeting his. I suggest we think like him. Falcone is vain. He prides himself on his intelligence, not his strength. Attacking the warehouse, even if we succeed, only feeds his ego. He wants a street war. We don't. She pointed to another spot on the map, an elegant casino in the city center. This is what matters to him, the La Luna Casino. It's his crown jewel, his most profitable money-laundering operation, and more importantly, it's the symbol of his legitimate power. It's where he courts politicians and businessmen. It's the source of his pride. She looked up, meeting Enzo's eyes. You don't attack his muscle. You attack his pride. You don't burn down a warehouse. You humiliate him. You use the law against him. A well-placed, anonymous tip with evidence only an insider could have. Evidence we can manufacture. Let the federal police shut down his casino in the middle of a gala night. Let the world see Marco Falcone being treated like the common criminal he is. The silence in the room was absolute. The men stared at her with a new kind of respect. They saw the cold, ruthless logic in her words. It was a strategy that would never have occurred to them. It was subtle. It was intelligent. It was cruel. It was a queen's move. Enzo stood up. Do as she says, he commanded, his voice filled with a pride he didn't try to hide. The operation was a resounding success. Falcone's casino was raided, his books seized, his wealthy guests humiliated. The blow wasn't to his finances, he would recover, but to his reputation. Enzo hadn't attacked him as a rival mobster. He had treated him like an insect to be crushed by bureaucracy. From that day on, no one ever referred to Elisa as the girl again. She was the Donna. Their partnership deepened. The nights were no longer silent and empty. They talked for hours in Enzo's private study, sharing fears, strategies, and dreams. He taught her about the empire he inherited, and she reminded him of the man he was before it all. One night, she found him staring out his bedroom window, the city glittering below like a carpet of broken diamonds. He seemed distant, the weight of the world on his shoulders. She came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his broad back. He relaxed into her touch, covering her hands with his. What are you thinking about? She whispered. Them, he said, his voice low. Falcone, the others, this world. Sometimes I wonder if there's any way out. Maybe the way isn't out, she said, holding him tighter. Maybe it's through. He turned in her arms, his face serious. What do you mean? You're fighting your father's war, Enzo. Reacting, defending. But you're not your father. You don't have to fix his world. You have to build yours. She touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. An empire doesn't have to be built on fear alone. It can be built with intelligence, with loyalty, with a power so absolute and quiet that no one dares to challenge it. In that moment, he saw her not just as the woman he loved. He saw her as his equal, his greatest ally. The art restorer had found her final masterpiece. Not an ancient painting, but a broken man and the dark empire he ruled. And she was ready to restore them, to give them a new shape, a new strength. What would I be without you? He murmured, his voice thick with emotion. A lonely king in an empty castle, she answered softly, and I would be just a memory in a dusty gallery. He kissed her, a slow, deep kiss, full of promise, and a future they would build together, brick by brick, shadow by shadow. The war was not yet over, but the most important battle had already been won. They were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting to rule. Together. Elisa's strategy proved more effective than any bullet. The Mafia world, accustomed to bursts of violence and street wars, didn't know how to react to the silent war the Costellos were waging. Instead of bloody retaliations, Enzo and Elisa dismantled Falcone's empire piece by piece, using the law, the media, and financial manipulation. They were surgeons severing their enemies' arteries, while Falcone continued to swing an axe, finding only air. Marco Falcone, humiliated and increasingly isolated, became more dangerous. A cornered animal. He abandoned subtlety and resorted to terror, hoping to force Enzo into an open war. A battlefield where he felt more comfortable. Small bombs exploded in Costello-owned cafes. Low-level associates were attacked. They were the desperate moves of a man losing control. Enzo felt the pressure from his men to fight fire with fire, but Elisa held him steady. "It's what he wants," she said one night as they reviewed reports in his study. The aroma of strong coffee mingled with the scent of old books. "He wants you to stoop to his level. He wants chaos. Don't give it to him." "My men are dying, Elisa." Enzo's voice was a low growl, his frustration evident. "And more will die if you play his game," she replied, her voice calm but unshakable. She stood and went to a large map of the city pinned to the wall. "He's attacking the periphery, the edges. He doesn't dare strike the heart, because he knows the heart is strong. So instead of defending the edges, we cut off his head." Enzo's silence was an invitation for her to continue. "Falcone has a son," Elisa said, tapping a wealthy area of the city. "Matteo, 22. He's the only thing Marco Falcone loves more than himself. He's kept him clean, away from the business. The boy studies architecture at the university. He is Falcone's redemption, his legitimate legacy." Enzo stiffened. "We don't touch families, civilians. It's the code." "And Falcone broke the code when he put a white rose in my path," Elisa said, turning to face him, her eyes shining with a cold, hard light. "He brought the war to our home. He made me a target. The code no longer exists for him. But I'm not talking about violence. Violence is his tool. Ours is fear. Ours..." Her plan was audacious, cruel, and brilliant. A week later, Matteo Falcone was leaving a night class at the university. He was walking across the dark campus toward his sports car when he was surrounded. Not by street thugs, but by men in impeccable suits who emerged from silent, black sedans. There was not a single punch thrown, not a single verbal threat. They simply took him, placed a black velvet hood over his head, and drove away. Matteo was taken not to a damp cellar, but to a luxury suite in a 5-star hotel. When the hood was removed, he was sitting in a plush armchair. In front of him, sitting in another armchair, was Elisa Costello. She wore a simple, elegant black dress. Beside her, on a small table, was a teapot and 2 cups. The only other person in the room was Rocco, standing silently by the door. The terror on the young man's face was palpable. "What? What do you want?" "My father will..." "Your father can do nothing," Elisa interrupted, her voice soft, almost melodic, "because he doesn't know where you are, and because right now he is receiving a gift." She poured a cup of tea and pushed it toward him. "Drink. It will calm your nerves." Matteo stared at the tea as if it were poison. "It's not poisoned, Matteo," Elisa said with a small smile. "We are not like your father. We don't kill children to prove a point. We educate." Meanwhile, across town, a furious Marco Falcone was in his office when one of his men entered, pale. He was carrying an elegant gift box, tied with a black silk ribbon. "It just arrived, boss. No return address." With hands shaking with rage, Falcone tore the box open. Inside, on a bed of velvet, was his son's wristwatch, an expensive graduation gift, and his cell phone. On the phone screen, a single photo was open. Matteo, sitting in the hotel armchair, terror etched on his face. And next to him, the untouched cup of tea. Falcone's blood ran cold. It wasn't a ransom demand. It was a declaration of power. "I have your son. I can touch him any time. He is alive only because I allow it." Back at the hotel, Elisa leaned forward. "Your father has started a war he cannot win, Matteo. He is hurting good men, causing pain to families, all for the sake of pride. And now, he has brought you into this world, the world he tried to spare you from." She stood up. "You will go home, unharmed, but you will take him a message. Tell him the Costellos do not forget. Tell him the war is over. He lost. If he makes one more move, if one more of my men is harmed, the next cup of tea I offer you will not be just tea." She signaled to Rocco. The hood was placed back over Matteo's head. He was left in a park near his home, shaken but unharmed. When Matteo confronted his father, telling him the story, something inside Marco Falcone broke. He looked at the terror in his son's eyes, the only legacy he truly valued, and he saw the abyss. He hadn't been beaten by bullets or bombs. He had been defeated by the silent threat of a woman who refused to play his game. He had been outmaneuvered. The war didn't end with a bang, but with a whisper. The attack stopped. Falcone retreated into the shadows, a defeated king in his own castle. At the Costello estate, the victory was celebrated not with champagne, but with silence. Elisa stood on the terrace, looking out at the city lights. The night was cool, but she didn't feel it. Enzo came up behind her, wrapping her in a coat and his arms. "It's over," he said, his voice low in her ear. "For now," she replied, leaning her head against his chest. "Men like him don't disappear. They wait." "Then we'll wait too," Enzo said, "but we wait together." They stood there for a long time, two figures united against the darkness. They had faced betrayal, kidnapping, and war. They had turned a contract of shadows into an alliance of power. Elisa was no longer the monster's wife. She was his queen. And together, they ruled a reborn empire, not from the ashes of a war, but from the strength of a love that refused to die. They had found peace, not in a world without monsters, but by becoming the undisputed sovereigns of their own private hell. The peace that settled after Falcone's silent surrender was unlike anything Viridia's underworld had ever known. It wasn't the fragile peace of a truce, but the heavy, unquestionable peace of absolute power. The Costello name, once synonymous with unpredictable violence, was now whispered with a new kind of reverence. Enzo was still the shadow, but now he had a counterpart. Elisa, the silent Donna, the strategist whose mind was considered more lethal than any army. Together, they began to reshape their empire. Gratuitous violence was replaced by surgical efficiency. The illegal businesses that drew unnecessary attention were slowly phased out, replaced by legitimate enterprises that laundered not just money, but the family's reputation. They bought logistics companies, invested in technology, and infiltrated the real estate market. They were becoming a corporation, with roots so deep in the city's economy that pulling them out became impossible. Elisa flourished in her new role. She transformed the luxurious, cold mausoleum into a true home. The formal dining rooms were now used for Sunday dinners, with Enzo's most loyal lieutenants and their families. The laughter of children occasionally echoed through the marble halls, a sound that would have once been unthinkable. She herself never abandoned her studio. Restoring art kept her grounded, a constant reminder that beauty and history required patience and a delicate touch to be preserved, just like the man she loved. Enzo, for his part, changed in a way no one, not even himself, thought possible. The monster's armor didn't disappear completely. He was still capable of a terrifying coldness when necessary, but he no longer wore it at home. With Elisa, he was just Enzo. The constant tension in his shoulders eased. The haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a calm possessiveness whenever he looked at her. He smiled. It was a rare and disarming sight he reserved only for her, a glimpse of the boy she thought she had lost forever. One evening, a year after Falcone's fall, they were in his private study. A fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the book-lined walls. Elisa was curled up in an armchair, reading, while Enzo was at his desk, reviewing some documents. The silence between them was comfortable, a tapestry woven from trust and love. "I was thinking," Elisa said suddenly, lowering her book. Enzo looked up, his attention completely on her. "About what?" "About the future. Our future," she said. "We're building this empire. But for what? For whom?" He knew exactly what she meant. The legacy. A powerful name was one thing, but an empty name, without continuity, was just an echo waiting to fade. He stood and walked over to her, kneeling in front of her armchair. He took her hand, the one with the simple, worn gold band. "I used to think the Costello name was a curse that would end with me," he said, his voice low and serious. "A cycle of blood and revenge. But you, You've changed it." He kissed her knuckles. "Now, when I think of the future, I don't see darkness. I see possibility. I see this house filled with life. I see an heir who won't have to become a monster to survive, because we will have already defeated all of them." Elisa's eyes welled with tears. It was the confession she had been waiting for, the proof that the change in him was real and lasting. "Do you want that, Elisa?" he asked, vulnerability back in his eyes. "Do you want to bring a child into this world? Into our world?" She placed her free hand over his, which still held hers. In a slow, deliberate gesture, she guided his hand to her own belly. "I think," she whispered, a smile spreading across her face, "that decision has already been made for us." The understanding hit Enzo slowly, and then with the force of a wave. His eyes widened, disbelief giving way to a pure, overwhelming joy, an emotion so raw it seemed to break something inside him. He looked from her hand on her stomach to her face, searching for confirmation. She just nodded, the tears now rolling freely. He buried his face in her lap, and for the second time in his life, Elisa felt the powerful Don Costello's body shake. But this time, it was not from rage or fear. It was from a happiness so profound there were no words for it. He was crying, silent, choked sobs muffled against the fabric of her dress. She stroked his hair, her heart overflowing. The king of shadows, the monster forged in hell, was on his knees, weeping at the promise of a new life. In that moment, they were not the Don and Donna Costello. They were just a man and a woman, on the threshold of a future they had never dared to dream of. The war might have been over, but the greatest adventure of their lives was just beginning. They would build a legacy not of fear, but of strength, of a legacy for the son or daughter who would inherit not just a name, but a reborn empire, and a love that had proven to be stronger than darkness itself. 5 years later, the late afternoon sun cast a golden light over the gardens of the Costello estate. The sound that dominated the air was not the tense silence of the past, but the most precious sound in the world, a child's laughter. Alessandro Costello, age 4, raced across the grass, his dark hair flying, his father's eyes shining with a boyish joy that Enzo never had the chance to experience. He chased a red soccer ball with fierce determination, occasionally glancing back to make sure his audience was watching. They were. Seated on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, Enzo and Elisa watched. Enzo wasn't wearing a suit. He was in linen trousers and a cotton shirt, looking more like a country aristocrat than a mafia boss. One arm rested casually around Elisa's shoulders, the touch both possessive and tender. Elisa, radiant, leaned her head on his shoulder. Peace settled on her like a second skin. She was still the silent Donna, the mind behind the throne. But here, in the sanctuary of her family, she was simply a mother and a wife. "He has your stubbornness," Enzo said, his voice a satisfied murmur as they watched Alessandro trip, fall, and immediately get back up, more determined than before. "And your eyes," Elisa replied softly. "He sees everything." It was true. The boy had a quiet intensity that was reminiscent of his father, but there was no darkness in it. Only curiosity, and an unshakable confidence that he was safe. The world outside those walls had not disappeared. The Costello Empire was more powerful and influential than ever, a corporate hydra with tentacles in every sector of the city. Enemies still existed, but they were kept at bay by a reputation for ruthless efficiency and an intelligence that bordered on prescience. No one dared to challenge the Shadow and the Donna. Rocco approached them, an older man now, his face etched with a deep respect. He kept a respectful distance. "Boss, Donna." Enzo didn't take his eyes off his son. "What is it, Rocco?" "News about Falcone. He died this morning, liver failure, drank himself to the end." The news hung in the air for a moment. The end of an era. The last ghost of Enzo's past, finally exorcised. There was no triumph on Enzo's face, only a resigned weariness. "May God have mercy on his soul," Elisa said quietly, and she truly meant it. "Yes," Enzo agreed. "Let the dead bury their dead." Rocco nodded and retreated, leaving them to their peace. Alessandro ran up to them, the ball tucked under his arm, his face flushed with exertion. "Papa, Mama, look." He opened his small hand to reveal an iridescent beetle. Enzo scooped him up and settled him on his lap. "That's a fine specimen, champ. A strong soldier." "Like you, Papa?" the boy asked, his eyes serious. Enzo's heart tightened. He looked at Elisa over his son's head, a universe of emotion passing between them. He was a soldier. He would always be. But his war was so that his son would never have to be one. "Yes, son," Enzo said, his voice hoarse, "like me. But you're going to build things, not tear them down." He hugged the boy tightly. Elisa placed her hand over both of them, her small family, her entire universe. Later that night, after Alessandro was asleep, Elisa found Enzo in his study. He wasn't working. He was standing in front of the small drawing pad she had seen the first day she entered the room. She came up beside him and looked over his shoulder. On the page was a single charcoal drawing, rendered with a surprisingly skilled hand. It was her face, as she was at 18, laughing, with the sun in her hair. "You kept it," she whispered, touching the paper. "I could never throw it away," he said, turning to her. "In the darkest years when I thought I had lost everything, this was the only proof that I ever had a soul." He pulled her into his arms. "You gave it back to me, Elisa. You restored something I thought was broken forever." "We restored each other," she corrected, tilting her face up to his, piece by piece. He kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss of their reunion, nor the promising kiss of their reconciliation. It was a kiss of hard-won peace, of a love that had been tested by fire, betrayal, and time, and had emerged not just intact, but indestructible. The contract of shadows had become a covenant of light, a promise that no matter how dark the night became, they would always be each other's safe harbor. The king and queen in their empire, ruling not just an underworld, but a future they had built themselves, a future where love was the most powerful weapon of all.